The wooden gavel slammed down like a gunshot, echoing through the dusty saloon of Purgatory Creek. Sold for $3 to the man in the black duster. The crowd gasped. $3 was the price of a lame horse, not a human life. Abigail Halloway, 19, and trembling looked up at her purchaser. He didn't look like a husband. He looked like a grim reaper coated in trail dust. But the terror didn't truly start until they reached his isolated cabin. When the silent cowboy finally dropped to one knee before her, Abigail didn't swoon. She screamed. What she saw in that moment would change the history of the West forever. October 18th, 1874. Purgatory Creek, Wyoming Territory. The air in the Gilded Horn Saloon smelled of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and despair. It was a thick, choking atmosphere that clung to the back of Abigail Halloway's throat. She stood on a makeshift wooden crate, her wrists bound with rough hemp rope that chafed against her pale skin. She was 19 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher who had died of consumption 2 winters ago, and a father who had gambled away everything they owned before putting a bullet in his own head last Tuesday. This was his final legacy. Abigail auctioned off to pay his debts to Cyrus Blackwood, the town's wealthiest and cruelest land baron. "Look at her, gentlemen," the auctioneer, "a greasy man named Silas." "Wait, no. Let's use Jedediah." "Crump," sneered, grabbing Abigail's chin with a dirty hand. She flinched, pulling away, but the rope held her fast. "Clean teeth, wide hips, a virgin or so the late Mr. Halloway swore on his grave. Do I hear $50? Abigail kept her eyes fixed on the floorboards. She counted the knotholes to keep from crying. 1, 2, 3, 20, shouted a miner near the front, his face smeared with soot. 25, counted a man in a velvet suit, likely a pimp from down in Cheyenne. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew what happened to women bought in these auctions. They weren't wives. They were livestock. $40, the voice boomed from the back of the room. It was Cyrus Blackwood himself. He sat at a poker table swirling a glass of whiskey, a predatory grin on his face. He didn't want a wife. He wanted to break the daughter of the man who owed him money. It was a game to him. The room went silent. No one outbid Blackwood, not in Purgatory Creek. "Going once at 40. Jedediah raised the gavel. $3. The voice was low, gravelly, and cut through the silence like a serrated knife. It came from the darkest corner of the saloon, where the shadows seemed to pool. The crowd murmured. Blackwood laughed a harsh, barking sound. $3, you insult me, stranger. The girl is worth at least 50 in labor alone." A chair scraped against the floor. A man stood up. He was towering easily. 6'3", wearing a long, weather-beaten duster coat that had once been black but was now stained with the grey dust of the high plains. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his eyes, but the stubble on his jaw was thick and dark. He walked into the light, his spurs chinking with a heavy, rhythmic metal sound. Clink, step, clink, step. He stopped directly in front of Blackwood. $3, the stranger repeated. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. "And the debt note her father signed." Blackwood's smile faltered. "Who are you?" "Elias Graham." The name hit the room like a physical blow. The whispering stopped instantly. Even the piano player froze. Elias Graham. The bounty hunter of the Badlands. The man who had tracked the butcher of Abilene across 3 states and brought him back in a sack. Graham reached into his coat. Several men reached for their guns, but he only pulled out 3 heavy silver dollars and slapped them onto Blackwood's table. Then he slammed a piece of paper down next to them. It was a bounty warrant. "Your brother Thomas Blackwood," Elias said calmly. "Wanted for bank robbery in Omaha. I found him. I turned him in. The reward covers the girl's debt plus $3 for the inconvenience of standing in this smell." Blackwood's face turned purple. He stood up, his hand hovering near his holster. "You think you can walk in here and buy my property with chump change?" "She ain't property, Cyrus," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave. His hand didn't move toward his gun. It just hung loosely by his side, dangerously relaxed. "She's a citizen, and unless you want the U.S. Marshals looking into why you're auctioning women in a territory that's trying to get statehood, you'll take the $3. Blackwood looked around the room. He saw the fear in the men's eyes. He saw the legendary Colt Peacemaker on Elias's hip. He spat on the floor, right next to the silver coins. "Take her," Blackwood hissed. "She's scrawny anyway. Probably won't last the winter." Elias didn't answer. He walked to the crate, tossed the 3 coins to the stunned auctioneer, and pulled a knife from his belt. Abigail squeezed her eyes shut, preparing for pain. But she only felt the sudden release of pressure as the ropes fell away. "Walk," Elias said. It wasn't a request. He turned and strode out of the saloon. The saloon doors swinging violently behind him. Abigail, rubbing her raw wrists, scrambled off the crate and ran to catch up her cheap leather shoes, skidding on the sawdust. She had been bought for $3 by a killer, and she had no idea if she had just been saved or damned. Outside, the wind was howling, kicking up dust devils that danced down the main street. Elias Graham was already mounting a massive black stallion, a beast that looked as mean as its master. He looked down at Abigail, who stood shivering in her thin cotton dress. "You ride behind," he grunted, extending a hand. It was a rough, calloused hand, scarred across the knuckles. Abigail hesitated. Where are we going?" "Away from Blackwood," was all he said. He pulled her up with surprising ease, swinging her onto the horse's rump behind the saddle. "Hold on to the leather. Not me," he ordered. They rode out of Purgatory Creek, in silence, the horses' hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth. The town faded behind them, replaced by the vast, terrifying emptiness of the Wyoming wilderness. The landscape was brutal, jagged rocks, scrub brush, and a sky so big it made you feel insignificant. For 3 hours they didn't speak. Abigail's legs ached, and the cold wind bit through her dress, turning her skin to gooseflesh. She stared at the back of Elias's coat. It smelled of tobacco, horse sweat, and gun oil. Who was this man? Why had he intervened? The rumors about Elias Graham were terrifying. They said he had no heart, that he had cut it out himself to be a better killer. They said he lived alone in the mountains, because civilized folk couldn't stand the sight of him. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and blood orange, Elias steered the horse off the main trail and up a narrow, rocky path leading into the foothills. "Please," Abigail whispered, her voice hoarse from the dust. "Are you going to kill me?" Elias didn't turn around. "If I wanted you dead, girl, I would have let Blackwood keep you." "Then what do you want? I don't know how to be a wife. I can cook a little, and I can read, but—" "Quiet," he snapped. But there was no heat in it, just exhaustion. They reached a small cabin tucked under the overhang of a granite cliff. It was hidden, defensible, and rugged just like him. There was a corral for the horse and a small stream nearby. It wasn't a home. It was a hideout. Elias dismounted and helped her down. His hands lingered on her waist for a fraction of a second too long, but not in a lecherous way, more like he was weighing her, testing her fragility. He pointed to the cabin door. "Inside, fire's laid. Light it." Abigail hurried inside. The cabin was sparse. A single cot, a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a cast-iron stove. She found the matches and lit the kindling in the stove, her hands shaking so badly she wasted 2 matches. By the time the fire was crackling, Elias entered. He carried his saddlebags and a rifle. He kicked the door shut and barred it. The atmosphere in the small room shifted instantly. The vastness of the outside was gone, replaced by an intimate, suffocating proximity. It was just the 2 of them, the virgin bride and the bounty hunter. Elias took off his hat and tossed it on the table. For the first time, Abigail saw his face clearly in the firelight. He was younger than she expected, maybe 32, but his eyes were ancient. They were the color of steel, hard and unyielding. A jagged white scar ran from his left temple down into his hairline. He was handsome in a terrifying, jagged way. He stared at her, his gaze intense, sweeping from her messy brown hair to her worn shoes. He took a step toward her. Abigail backed up until she hit the rough log wall. "Mr. Graham, Sit," he said, pointing to the chair. She sat her knees, knocking together. Elias sighed a heavy sound that seemed to rattle his chest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded pocket knife. He flicked it open. The blade glinted in the orange light. Abigail's breath hitched. This is it, she thought. He's crazy. He's going to mark me like cattle. He walked toward her, the spurs clinking. Clink. Step. He stopped right in front of her. He towered over her small frame. Then slowly, deliberately, Elias Graham lowered himself. He went down on one knee. Abigail's eyes widened. Was he proposing, mocking her? He reached out his left hand and grabbed her ankle firmly. Abigail looked down. She saw the knife in his right hand, inching toward her leg. She saw the intense focus in his eyes. And then she saw something else. As his sleeve rode up his arm, a brand was visible on his forearm. It wasn't a ranch brand. It was a symbol, a circle with a cross through it. She recognized it. She had seen it once before, carved into the grip of the pistol that her father had used to kill himself. Terror cold and absolute washed over her. He wasn't a savior. He was part of the debt. He was the Reaper. Elias moved the knife toward her skin. Abigail opened her mouth and screamed. It was a blood-curdling sound that bounced off the cabin walls, a scream of pure, unadulterated panic. "No, don't touch me!" she shrieked, kicking out violently. Her boot connected with his shoulder, knocking him off balance. Elias roared, "Hold still, damn it! You killed him!" she screamed, scrambling backward, knocking over the chair. "You're one of them. The dead circle." Elias froze on his knee, the knife hovering in mid-air. His expression shifted from irritation to shock. "What did you say? The brand on your arm?" Abigail pointed her finger, shaking. "My father. He warned me about the men with that mark." "You didn't buy me to save me. You bought me to finish the job." Elias looked down at his arm, then back at Abigail. The silence stretched heavy and dangerous. He slowly closed the knife and stood up. "You think I'm with the circle?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I saw the mark." Elias began to unbutton his shirt. Abigail huddled in the corner, covering her eyes. "Please, no. Look at me," he commanded. Abigail peeked through her fingers. Elias had pulled his shirt open. His chest was a road map of violent scars from bullets, knives, and claws, but right over his heart there was another tattoo. It was the same circle and cross, but someone had taken a knife and carved a deep, jagged X over it, scarring the skin in a brutal act of rejection. "I was with them," Elias said, his voice sounding like grinding stones. 10 years ago, before I realized what they were. Now," he gestured to the scar over his heart, "now I hunt them, and that brand on your father's gun, that didn't mean he was one of them, Abigail." He took a step closer, his eyes burning. "It meant he stole from them, and that means you are the only loose end they have left." Abigail lowered her hands, the fear slowly being replaced by confusion. What were you going to do with the knife?" Elias looked at the pocket knife, then gestured to the hem of her dress. "There's a tracking beacon sewn into your hem, a silver thread. Blackwood put it there. I was trying to cut it out before his men find this cabin." As if on cue, a distant sound echoed through the canyon walls outside. It wasn't the wind. It was the crack of a rifle. A bullet smashed through the cabin window, shattering the lantern on the table and plunging them into darkness. The darkness in the cabin was absolute, save for the moonlight slicing through the newly broken window and the dying embers of the fire spilling from the overturned stove. The smell of kerosene from the broken lantern stung the air, mixing with the sharp tang of sudden fear. Abigail didn't have time to scream again. Before the echo of the first shot faded, Elias moved with terrifying speed. He lunged across the short distance between them, his heavy hand clamping over her mouth to silence her. With his other arm, he swept her off her feet, carrying her away from the exposed center of the room, just as a second bullet punched through the thick oak door, sending splinters flying like deadly confetti. He threw her down behind the heavy cast-iron stove. It was cold now, but solid enough to stop a Winchester slug. "Stay down," he hissed, his voice vibrating against her ear. "Do not move unless the cabin is on fire. Do you understand?" Abigail nodded frantically into the dark, her heart hammering against her ribs, so hard she thought it might crack them. Elias was gone instantly, melting into the shadows. She heard the distinct shuck-clack of a lever-action rifle being cycled. He moved to the left side of the door, pressing his back against the logs, peering through a small chink in the mortar. Outside, voices shouted over the wind. "We know you're in there. Graham Blackwood wants the girl. Give her up, and we might let you die quick." It was the voice of the pimp in the velvet suit from the saloon, a man named Beauregard, a coward who hired guns to do his dirty work. Elias didn't answer. He waited. He was a statue carved from shadow and patience. Another volley of shots tore into the cabin. Window glass shattered completely. Tin plates on the shelves clattered to the floor. Abigail curled into a ball, her hands over her ears, praying to a god she wasn't sure listened to people in the Wyoming Territory anymore. Then Elias moved. He stepped in front of the broken window for a fraction of a second, the muzzle flash of his Winchester lighting up the room like a lightning strike. Crack! Crack! 2 shots fired in rapid succession. Outside, a man screamed a wet, gurgling sound that ended abruptly. Then silence. "That's one of Blackwood's imported hired guns down," Elias muttered to himself, cycling the rifle again. 3 left, if my count is right. He crawled low across the floor, back toward Abigail, She flinched as he approached, but he grabbed her ankle again, softer this time. "The knife," she whispered tremulously. "You still have the knife." "I need the hem of your dress, Abigail," he whispered urgently, his eyes scanning the windows. "They found us too fast. That tracker is still transmitting. If they miss killing us tonight, they'll just follow us tomorrow." Abigail hesitated only a moment. The reality of the bullets ripping through the wood was far more terrifying than the man beside her. She bunched up the heavy cotton skirt of her cheap wedding dress, the one her father had bought her just before he died, and thrust the hem toward him. Elias worked by feel in the dark. His thick fingers were surprisingly deft. He located the stiff ridge in the fabric. He didn't bother being gentle with the cloth. He sliced the hem open with a quick jerk of the blade. He dug his thumb in and popped out a small metallic disc no bigger than a fingernail. "High-tech gadgetry for the frontier," Elias growled. "Blackwood's got expensive friends back east." He crawled to the fireplace, tossed the disc into the remaining hot coals, and covered it with ash. A moment later there was a tiny muffled pop and a flare of unnatural green light that died as quickly as it appeared. "Now they're blind," Elias said, "and that's going to make them desperate." As if on cue, something heavy thumped against the roof of the cabin. A second later, the smell of burning pitch drifted down. "Fire arrows," Elias cursed. "They're trying to burn us out." The situation had shifted from desperate to critical in seconds. The cabin logs were dry as old bones. The roof was thatch and sod. It would go up like a torch. "We have to move," Elias said, pulling Abigail to her feet. He shoved his Colt peacemaker into her trembling hands. The metal was heavy and cold. "Do you know how to use this? I've shot rabbits with a varmint rifle, but point it at anything that isn't me and pull the trigger until it clicks. Come on." He kicked the bar off the back door, a smaller exit facing the cliff face leading toward the horse corral. He threw it open. The night air rushed in, feeding the flames that were already crackling on the roof above them. "Run for the horse," Elias commanded, pushing her out into the night. "I'll cover you." Abigail stumbled out into the cold wind. The massive black stallion Brimstone was rearing in the corral, terrified by the fire and the noise. Behind her, Elias stepped into the doorway and unleashed a torrent of covering fire toward the front of the cabin, keeping the attackers pinned down. Crack, crack, crack. Abigail reached the corral fence, her breath tearing at her throat. She fumbled with the latch. A bullet kicked up dirt inches from her foot. She cried out, dropping the revolver. "Leave it! Get on the horse!" Elias roared, sprinting toward her as the cabin roof began to collapse in a shower of sparks. He vaulted the fence, grabbed Brimstone's halter, and forced the panicked animal, still long enough to grab Abigail by the waist and throw her into the saddle. He swung up behind her, the leather groaning under their combined weight. "Hang on!" Elias kicked the stallion hard. Brimstone lunged forward, smashing through the flimsy corral gate. They galloped into the darkness away from the burning cabin that stood like a beacon against the black cliffs. Behind them, shouts and ineffective gunfire faded into the distance as the attackers scrambled to save their own skins from the blaze or get to their horses. They didn't stop. Elias rode with reckless intensity, guiding the horse down treacherous rocky paths entirely by moonlight. Abigail buried her face in the rough wool of his duster, her arms wrapped tight around his waist, the smell of smoke and fear clinging to them both. They were alive, but they had lost their shelter, and the wilderness was vast and unforgiving. They rode for 2 hours, putting miles of confusing, twisted canyon terrain between them and Purgatory Creek. Elias doubled back, twice rode through a shallow stream for a mile to kill their scent, and finally ascended a steep, hidden switchback trail that led to a higher plateau. The adrenaline that had fueled Abigail began to crash, leaving her shaking uncontrollably. The cold mountain air bit through her thin dress, and her teeth chattered so hard her jaw ached. Elias seemed to sense her failing strength. He slowed Brimstone to a walk as they approached a dense thicket of aspen and pine nestled against a rock wall. "Here," he murmured, his voice rough with exhaustion. "We stop here." He slid off the horse first, his landing heavy. He staggered slightly when his boots hit the ground, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth. Abigail practically fell off the horse, her legs numb. "Are they still following?" "Not tonight. They lost the tracker signal, and they won't track this path in the dark without breaking their necks. We're safe for a few hours." He led the horse into the thicket, tying the reins to a sapling. It was darker in here, sheltered from the wind, but still freezing. "Gather wood, small dry stuff from the underbrush. We need a fire low and smokeless." Abigail obeyed numbly. Her hands were raw, but the need for warmth was primal. While she scraped together a meager pile of twigs and pine needles, Elias unsaddled the horse and laid the heavy saddle blanket on the ground beneath the overhang of the rock wall. He struck a match, shielding the flame with his large body until the kindling caught. The tiny flicker of orange light was the most beautiful thing Abigail had ever seen. As the fire grew, casting dancing shadows against the rock, Abigail looked at Elias across the flames. He had removed his heavy duster and was sitting with his back against the stone wall, his shirt pulled up on the left side. He was pressing a wad of cloth against his ribs. The cloth was dark, soaked with blood. Abigail gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "You're shot!" Elias grimaced, trying to get a look at the wound himself. "Just a graze. One of Beau's boys got lucky when we were mounting up. Took a piece of skin off my ribs." "Let me see." The words were out before she thought about them. He looked up at her, surprised by the steel in her tone. She crawled around the small fire, kneeling beside him. Up close, the smell of fresh blood was metallic and sharp, mixing with his sweat. He didn't stop her as she gently pulled his hand away. It was a nasty furrow along his lower rib cage, not deep enough to hit an organ, but ragged and bleeding freely. "It needs cleaning," she said, her voice steadier than her hands. "Do you have whiskey in your saddlebags and a clean shirt?" Elias nodded toward the bags he'd dropped. Abigail retrieved a flask and a spare flannel shirt. She poured some of the amber liquid onto a piece of the shirt. "This will sting," she warned. Elias let out a dry chuckle. "I've had worse, girl. Just do it." She pressed the alcohol-soaked cloth to the wound. Elias's entire body seized up. His jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek and a low groan escaped him. But he didn't pull away. Abigail worked quickly, cleaning the grit from the wound and wrapping his torso tightly with strips torn from the flannel shirt to staunch the bleeding. For 10 minutes they were silent, existing in a strange intimacy forced by survival. The terrifying bounty hunter was bleeding and the virgin bride was patching him up. When she was finished, she sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead, leaving a smudge of his blood there. Elias looked down at the bandage, then up at her. The hard, terrifying look in his grey eyes had softened into something contemplative. "You got steady hands for a schoolteacher's daughter," he said quietly. "My mother was sick for a long time before she died," Abigail said, staring into the fire. "I learned to be useful. It was better than just watching her fade." She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering violently again now that the task was done. The fire was too small to combat the deep mountain cold. Without a word, Elias reached out and grabbed the heavy wool duster he had discarded. He shook it out and draped it around her shoulders. It was massive on her, engulfing her in its weight and his scent, but the warmth was immediate. "Thank you," she whispered. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic chewing of brimstone nearby. "The dead circle," Abigail said suddenly, needing to fill the silence, needing answers. "My father. He said they owned everything west of the Mississippi that wasn't nailed down. He said they were ghosts." Elias threw another stick on the fire. "They aren't ghosts. They're flesh and blood, and they bleed just like anyone else. But your father was right about them owning things." He leaned his head back against the rock, his eyes half closed. "The circle isn't a gang. It's a business. They run gambling, prostitution, opium, and land-grabbing schemes from St. Louis to San Francisco. They buy politicians and judges. They thrive on chaos because chaos is profitable. And you were one of them." It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "I was young, angry at the world after the war. They found me, saw I could shoot straight, and didn't ask questions. They branded me and put me to work enforcing debts." He touched the scar over his heart absently. "It took me 2 years to realize I wasn't a soldier for them. I was just a butcher." He turned his gaze to her. "When I left, I didn't just walk away. I burned down their warehouse in Denver. Cost them $50,000. That's why they gave me this." He gestured to the scar over the brand. "The X. It means excommunicate. It means kill on sight." Abigail absorbed this. The weight of his past hung heavy in the air between them. "And my father, your father was a fool," Elias said bluntly, not sparing her feelings. "He liked cards better than he liked paying his bills. He borrowed money from Blackwood's bank to play in a high-stakes game run by a Circle affiliate in Cheyenne. He lost. Blackwood is the Circle's man in this territory. Your father tried to run." Elias leaned forward, his eyes intense in the firelight. "The brand on his gun wasn't a badge of honor, Abigail. They carved it into his favorite piece to remind him that every time he picked it up, he belonged to them until he paid." Abigail felt sick. The suicide, the auction. It all made a sickening kind of sense now. So Blackwood, selling me, that was just recovering to the debt. Partially. But Blackwood is cruel. He liked the idea of breaking Holloway's innocent daughter. It amused him. Abigail looked down at her hands. They were stained with soot and blood. "And why did you buy me $3 and a bounty warrant for a bank robber? Why not just let Blackwood have me and save yourself the trouble? You're hunting the Circle. Isn't that enough?" Elias was silent for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. He looked at the fire, the flames reflecting in his steel-grey eyes. "Maybe I got tired of only hunting the monsters," he said, his voice barely a whisper, lost to the wind outside their shelter. "Maybe just once I wanted to stop them before the damage was done." He looked at her, then really looked at her, seeing not just a debt paid, but a terrified young woman wrapped in his coat, trying to be brave. "Get some sleep, Abigail. Tomorrow we have to ride hard. Blackwood won't stop. Not now that I've embarrassed him and burned his tracker." Abigail curled up on the edge of the saddle blanket, pulling the duster tight. She watched Elias through sleepy eyes. He didn't sleep. He sat with his rifle across his lap, watching the darkness beyond the firelight. A scarred guardian demon, protecting her from the devils he used to call brothers. Despite the cold, despite the danger for the first time since her father died, Abigail Halloway didn't feel entirely alone. The Wyoming high country did not forgive weakness, and it did not pity the desperate. 2 days after fleeing the burning cabin, the sky turned a bruised slate gray heavy with the promise of violence. The temperature plummeted, freezing the sweat on their skin and turning the breath of the black stallion Brimstone into great white plumes of steam. Elias was deteriorating. Abigail could feel the heat radiating off him even through the layers of wool and leather. He sat slumped in the saddle in front of her. Now she had taken the reins hours ago, when his grip had begun to falter. The graze on his ribs, initially dismissed as a flesh wound, had soured. The bullet had likely been dirty, or perhaps the unwashed flannel bandage hadn't been enough. Infection was setting in a slow poison, moving through his blood. "We need to stop," Abigail shouted over the rising wind. "Elias, you're burning up! Keep riding!" Elias rasped his voice, a ghost of its former command. He shifted, grimacing as pain tore through his side. "Blackwood has scouts! The ridge line! They'll see us if we stop!" Abigail looked back. The landscape was a jagged moor of granite and pine, empty, save for the swirling snow that had begun to fall. But she felt it too, the sensation of eyes on them. They were being herded. "There's a pass up ahead," Elias muttered, pointing a shaking hand toward a narrow cleft in the peaks. "Devil's Throat leads to the mining camps. We can lose them there." They pushed on. The snow began to fall in earnest, a white curtain that blotted out the horizon. The wind howled through the canyon like a banshee, stinging Abigail's cheeks and numbing her fingers. By the time they reached the entrance to Devil's Throat, the snow was fetlock deep. The pass was terrifyingly narrow, a shelf of rock barely wide enough for the horse, with a sheer drop of 1,000 feet on one side and a vertical cliff face on the other. "Dismount," Elias ordered, sliding off the horse before Abigail could protest. His legs buckled, and he hit the snow hard on one knee. "Elias!" Abigail scrambled down, rushing to his side. He shoved her away, not out of cruelty, but urgency. "Lead the horse. I'll walk behind. If I fall, you cut the saddlebags loose and ride. You hear me?" "I'm not leaving you," Abigail yelled, her anger flaring hot against the cold. "You bought me. Remember, that makes me your responsibility." Elias looked at her, his eyes glassy with fever, but burning with a strange mixture of pride and frustration. He didn't argue. He pulled his Winchester from the scabbard, using it as a crutch. They walked. The wind tore at them, threatening to shove them over the precipice. Every step was a battle. Abigail kept one hand on Brimstone's bridle and the other reaching back to steady Elias. They were halfway across the pass when the shot rang out. It didn't come from behind them. It came from above. A bullet struck the rock face inches from Abigail's head, spraying stone shards into her face. She screamed, ducking low against the horse's flank. "Ambush!" Elias roared, adrenaline momentarily burning through his fever. He dropped to one knee, levering the rifle. "Get down! They're on the ridge!" High above them, silhouettes appeared on the canyon rim. 3 men, dark shapes against the grey sky. Blackwood's men had anticipated the route. They hadn't trailed them. They had cut them off. Another shot whizzed past, striking the ground near Brimstone's hooves. The stallion reared, terrified. Abigail fought the reins, her boots slipping on the icy rock. If the horse went over the edge, they lost their supplies, their weapons, and their escape. "Let him go," Elias shouted. "Abigail, get to cover." "No." Abigail wrapped the reins around her forearm, dragging the horse toward a slight indentation in the cliff wall. She hauled the beast into the shallow shelter, then turned to look for Elias. He was exposed. He was firing back, the crack thump of his Winchester echoing through the canyon, but he was moving too slowly. A bullet took him in the thigh, a fleshy hit, but it knocked him flat. Elias. Abigail didn't think. She didn't calculate. She saw the Colt Peacemaker lying in the snow where it had fallen from Elias's holster. She scrambled out from the cover, diving for the gun. "Go back!" Elias screamed, trying to drag himself toward the edge. Abigail grabbed the heavy revolver. It was cold as ice, heavy as sin. She rolled onto her back, looking up at the ridge. She couldn't see the men clearly, just the flashes of their muzzle fire. "Point it at anything that isn't me," Elias had said. She gripped the gun with both hands, aimed at the silhouette on the far left, and pulled the trigger. The recoil nearly broke her wrists. The bullet went wide, chipping rock 10 feet to the left of the man, but it made them pause. They hadn't expected the girl to shoot. "Covering fire!" Abigail screamed more to herself than Elias. She cocked the hammer. Bang! Cock! Bang! She fired 3 rounds wildly, forcing the rifleman on the ridge to duck back. It was enough. Elias dragged himself into the alcove beside her and the horse. He was panting blood, soaking his leg to match his side. But he was alive. "You're crazy," he wheezed, looking at her with wide, shocked eyes. "You're absolutely crazy. I'm learning—" She snapped her hands, shaking so hard she almost dropped the gun. "Now what?" "We're pinned down. They have the high ground." Elias looked at the pass ahead. It narrowed even further, turning a corner around a jutting spire of rock. "The bridge," he muttered. "There's an old rope bridge around that bend. If we cross it and cut the lines, can you walk? I have to." The next 10 minutes were a blur of terror. Under sporadic gunfire from the ridge they moved. Abigail fired the last 2 rounds in the Colt to keep the men's heads down, then helped half carry Elias around the bend. The bridge was a nightmare, rotting planks, suspended by fraying hemp ropes over a gorge so deep the bottom was lost in mist. "Go," Elias said, pushing her toward it. "Take the horse. I'll hold them off here." "Stop trying to die," Abigail shouted. She slapped the horse's rump, sending brimstone clattering nervously onto the swaying bridge. The animal didn't like it, but the gunfire behind them was a frantic motivator. The horse bolted across, reaching the other side safely. "Together," Abigail said, grabbing Elias's arm. They stumbled onto the bridge. The wind swung it violently side to side. The wood groaned under their feet. Halfway across, a bullet snapped one of the vertical guide ropes near Abigail's hand. They threw themselves onto the far ledge, just as the pursuers rounded the bend behind them. "Cut it!" Elias yelled, collapsing in the snow. Abigail grabbed the knife from his belt, the same knife he had almost used on her that first night. She sawed frantically at the main anchor ropes. The hemp was thick, frozen stiff. 3 men were running toward the bridge on the other side. "Stop her!" "Shoot the girl!" Abigail screamed in effort, putting her entire body weight into the blade. The first rope snapped with a sound like a whip crack. The bridge lurched, twisting sideways. The men on the other side skidded to a halt, afraid to step on the unstable structure. She sawed at the second rope. "I'll kill you, you little witch!" one of the men shouted, raising his rifle. Elias, lying prone in the snow, raised his Winchester one last time. His hand wavered, then steadied. He fired. The man raising his rifle spun backward, falling off the cliff edge. He didn't scream. He just vanished into the white void. A split second later, Abigail severed the second rope. The bridge collapsed, swinging down and slamming into the canyon wall on the far side with a thunderous crash. They were safe. The chasm between them was impassable. Abigail dropped the knife and fell to her knees, gasping for air. She looked at Elias. He had dropped the rifle and was lying on his back, staring up at the falling snow. His eyes were closing. "Elias!" She crawled to him, shaking his shoulders. "Elias, wake up!" He groaned, his head lolling to the side. "Tired, Abby. Just tired. No sleeping," she commanded, tears freezing on her cheeks. "You don't get to sleep." She managed to get him onto the horse. It took every ounce of strength she possessed, using a leverage technique she'd seen farmers use for sacks of grain. She tied his hands to the saddle horn so he wouldn't fall. She took the reins and began to walk, leading them blindly into the storm. She didn't know where they were going. She only knew that if they stopped, the cold or the fever would finish what the dead circle had started. Memory was a fickle thing for Elias Graham. For 2 days it came in fever dreams. He remembered the smell of black powder from the war. He remembered the face of the first man he killed. He remembered the cold eyes of the circle's leader in St. Louis. And then he remembered soft hands, a voice that sang hymns in a low, trembling alto. The taste of melted snow water trickled between his cracked lips. When he finally opened his eyes and they stayed open, the world was still. He was lying on a straw mattress in a room that smelled of sawdust and dried herbs. Sunlight, bright, piercing winter sunlight, streamed through a window. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain lanced through his side and leg, but it was a dull ache, not the sharp fire of infection. He looked down. He was in clean long johns. His wounds were stitched and poulticed with something that smelled like pungent root paste. "You're awake." Elias turned his head. Abigail was sitting in a rocking chair near the wood stove, a shotgun resting across her lap. She looked different. The terrified girl in the cheap wedding dress was gone. She wore a pair of oversized men's trousers, held up by suspenders, a heavy wool shirt, and her hair was braided back tightly. Her face was thinner, the cheekbones sharper, and there was a dark bruise on her jaw, but her eyes were clear. "Where are we?" Elias croaked. "Silver Hollow," she said, standing up and pouring him a cup of coffee. "It's a mining camp, about 20 miles north of the pass. You were out for 3 days." Elias took the cup, his hands shaking slightly. "How did we get here?" "I walked," she said simply. "A prospector found us on the trail, old man named Jeb. He helped me bring you in. He used to be a medic in the army. He stitched you up." Elias looked around the small cabin. "We're not safe here. Blackwood has spies in every camp." "I know," Abigail said. She walked to the window, peering out through the slats. "That's why we're leaving tonight. But we needed you to break the fever first." Elias watched her. A profound shift had occurred. She had saved him. The debt, if there ever was one, was paid 10 times over. "Abigail," he said softly. She turned. "You should leave me here," he said. "Take the horse. Go north to Montana. Change your name. You can start over." Abigail's expression hardened. She walked over to the bed, looming over him. "You paid $3 for me, Elias Graham. And the debt note said, 'Until death.' You don't look dead yet." She sat on the edge of the bed, her voice softening. "Besides, I found something in your coat pocket while I was cleaning your clothes. A map." Elias froze. That map is not for you. It marks a bank in Cheyenne and a safe deposit box number. She continued, ignoring him. That's what you were retrieving, wasn't it? Before you came for me. You were going to get the evidence to destroy the circle. Elias sighed, defeated. It's a ledger. Thomas Blackwood, the brother I turned in, he kept a book. Names, bribes, locations of their stash houses. I have the key. The book is in the bank. If I get that to the U.S. Marshal in Laramie, the dead circle crumbles. Then that's where we're going, Abigail declared. It's suicide. To get to Cheyenne, we have to go back down the mountain, through Purgatory Creek, or close enough to it. Then we fight, she said. Elias looked at her, and for the first time in 10 years, he felt a flicker of something dangerously like hope. He reached out and covered her hand with his. Okay. We fight. The plan was simple, which meant it was doomed to fail. They left Silver Hollow under the cover of a moonless night. Elias was weak but functional. He rode. Abigail rode behind him, armed with the shotgun. They didn't go to Cheyenne. They went to Purgatory Creek. It's the last place they'll expect us, Elias had argued. They think we're running north. We go right back into the Hornet's Nest, steal fresh horses from the livery, and take the train tracks east. It cuts 3 days off the journey. It was a bold gambit. They rode into the outskirts of the town at 3:00 a.m. The town was quiet, the saloon finally dark. They reached the livery stable. The smell of hay and manure was thick. Elias dismounted, painfully moving to quiet the stable boy, who was sleeping in the loft. Get 2 fresh mounts, Elias whispered to Abigail. Saddle them fast. I'll watch the door. Abigail moved quickly, her hands deft now, with buckles and straps. She chose a roan mare and a sturdy gelding. She was just tightening the cinch on the mare when the stable doors slammed shut. Lanterns flared to life in the rafters. Elias spun around his hand, going for his gun, but the distinct sound of a dozen hammers cocking froze him. Well, well, a voice dripped from the shadows. The prodigal hunter returns. Cyrus Blackwood stepped out from a stall holding a pearl-handled revolver. He was flanked by 10 men, deputies, hired guns, and the velvet-suited Beauregard. They had been waiting. You didn't think we'd really lose you, did you? Blackwood sneered. We picked up your trail the moment you bought penicillin from the dock in Silver Hollow. A man like you doesn't just heal by prayer. Elias stood tall, shielding Abigail with his body. Let her go, Cyrus. She's got nothing to do with this anymore. You want me? You want the ledger. It's yours. Oh, I know it's mine. Blackwood laughed. But I think I'll keep the girl, too. I paid good money for her auction after all. And now, she's damaged goods. Riding with a traitor that requires punishment. Run, Abigail. Elias whispered, his hand inching toward his gun. No, she whispered back. I said run. Elias drew. It was a blur of motion. Elias fanned the hammer of the peacemaker, dropping 2 men instantly. The stable erupted in gunfire. But there were too many of them. A bullet took Elias in the shoulder, spinning him around. Another hit him in the leg. The good one. He went down. Don't kill him, Blackwood shouted. I want him alive. I want to peel the skin off him slowly. Men swarmed Elias, kicking the gun from his hand, beating him with rifle butts. Abigail leveled the shotgun, but before she could pull the trigger, Beauregard grabbed the barrel, twisting it from her grip, and backhanding her across the face. She fell into the straw, dazed. She looked up to see them dragging Elias away. His face was a mask of blood, but his eyes were locked on hers. "Abigail," he groaned. Blackwood walked over to Abigail. He grabbed her by the hair, hauling her to her knees. He looked her up and down, sneering. "Lock her in the sheriff's cell," Blackwood ordered his men. "I'll deal with her after I'm done with Mr. Graham. I want her to hear him scream first." As they dragged Abigail away, she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She tasted the blood in her mouth, metallic and hot. She watched them drag Elias toward the saloon basement, the torture room. They thought they had won. They thought she was just a helpless girl. But as the cell door clanged shut on her, Abigail Halloway sat on the cold cot and felt around the waistband of her trousers. Her fingers brushed the cold steel of the small pocket knife Elias had given her to cut the bridge ropes. They hadn't searched her. Not thoroughly. She opened the blade. It was small, barely 2 inches, but it was enough to pick a lock, and Elias Graham was not going to die tonight. Not if the virgin bride had anything to say about it. The lock on the jail cell was old rusted iron. It stood no chance against Abigail's determination. With a satisfying click, the tumbler turned. She didn't run for the hills. She ran toward the smoke. Using a bottle of high-proof moonshine and a stolen box of matches, Abigail set the livery stable ablaze. As chaos erupted and Blackwood's men scrambled to save the horses, she slipped into the saloon basement. Elias was strung up by his wrists, beaten but conscious. Blackwood stood before him, a knife in hand. "Last chance, Graham. Where is the key to the deposit box?" "Behind you," Elias rasped. Blackwood spun around just as Abigail leveled a double-barreled shotgun she'd swiped from the sheriff's office. She didn't hesitate. She pulled the trigger. The blast didn't hit Blackwood. It blew the support beam next to him, bringing a massive section of the ceiling down. In the confusion, Abigail cut Elias down. He slumped against her, heavy and broken, but alive. "You came back," he whispered, disbelief warring with awe. "I told you," she grunted, shoving a Colt into his hand. "We fight." They emerged from the burning saloon into the street. Blackwood, bleeding from debris cuts, stumbled out after them, raising his pearl-handled revolver. "I bought you," Blackwood screamed at Abigail. "You belong to me." Elias Graham straightened up. He looked at the woman who had saved him. Not a victim, not a virgin bride, but a warrior forged in fire. He raised his gun. "She paid her own debt," Elias growled. Bang! One shot. Center mass. Cyrus Blackwood fell dead in the dirt of Purgatory Creek. The sun rose over the mountains, painting the town in gold. The dead circle was broken. Elias and Abigail stood amidst the wreckage, battered and scarred, but free. He didn't kneel this time. He just took her hand. "Best $3 I ever spent," he murmured. Abigail smiled, wiping soot from her face. "Shut up and kiss me, cowboy." And right there in the middle of the dusty street, he did. And that Friends is the legend of the $3 bride. What started as a cruel auction in a dusty saloon became one of the greatest tales of revenge and romance the West has ever known. Abigail Halloway proved that you can put a price on a person, but you can never buy their spirit. And Elias Graham learned that sometimes the only way to save your soul is to give it to someone else. If this story had you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. It helps the channel grow and lets us bring you more wild tales from the frontier. What would you have done in Abigail's shoes? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next trail.